Well, good morning. My name is Ryan Gordon. I'm the Family Forest Land Coordinator with the Oregon Department of Forestry, and it's my pleasure to be your host for today's Tree School Online webinar. Tree School Online is a production of the OSU Forestry and Natural Resources Extension Program and the Partnership for Forestry Education. We want to give special recognition to the Oregon Forest Resources Institute for leading this project, and to the Oregon Department of Forestry and the U.S. Forest Service for grant funds to help make the webinar series possible. Also, a reminder that Tree School online webinars are scheduled every Tuesday from now until July 28th. There are 2 webinars each Tuesday, one at 10 a.m. and the other at 3. This morning's webinar will be given by Chal Landgren, who is an Extension Christmas tree specialist and professor at Oregon State University. Chal's going to be providing an update on Christmas tree research, but before I introduce him, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping details. We're going to kind of just take a quick look around at the Zoom toolbar, which should be located at the bottom of your screen. If you don't see it, you can scroll your cursor over that area and it should pop up. On some devices like iPads or iPhones, it might look a little bit different. It could be at the top of the display. But most of the features that we're going to use today are accessible through that toolbar. Audio will be muted for all participants, and we're going to keep it that way through the webinar. Video also isn't available for you, but we will be making use of the Q&A function for written questions. That's going to be your primary way for interfacing with us throughout the webinar. And again, that is in that toolbar down at the bottom of the screen. The chat box should only be used if you're having problems, and that's going to be monitored by today's co-host, Mike Clowesy. Mike's working in the background, and he's going to help me out here and possibly be a backup for me in the event that my internet connection shuts down on us here. So do use that chat function just if you're having some technical issues, and make sure to direct your questions to the Q&A. There are resources that go along with most of our Tree School classes, and those can be found in the Tree School online class guide, which you can easily reach from the knowyourforest.org website. If you click on the webinar description, you'll be taken to an OSU extension website where you can access the resources that are available for each webinar. I want to let everybody know that these webinars are being recorded, and they'll be archived and available to view later on YouTube, and those will be accessible again through the knowyourforest.org website. And finally, we will be using polls during the webinar today. There's going to be one up front. We're going to ask a few questions about all of you. There'll be one towards the middle, and then finally we'll wrap things up with an evaluation poll at the end of today's webinar. The polls should pop up automatically on your screen in a box, and you'll have an opportunity to answer those questions. After you answer the questions, you can close it. If you don't see that box, if they don't pop up, again, take a look at that Zoom toolbar for the lighted poll button. And if that button's there, you should be able to click on it and pop those polls up and answer the questions. Okay, so now that we have all the housekeeping behind us, let's go ahead and get things started. Once again, today's presenter is Chal Landgren, and I'll invite him, there he is, turning his camera on. Chal's an extension specialist and professor at Oregon State University, and he leads the statewide Christmas tree extension program at the North Willamette Research and Extension Center. His program focuses on Christmas tree breeding, tree growth, and culturing integrated pest and farm management. Chal's been growing Christmas trees since 1982 on his small family farm, and he's been with OSU since 1980, although he started at the North Willamette Research and Extension Center back in 2008. So Chal, thanks for joining us, and I'll let you go ahead and introduce your presentation before we start the first poll.
Thank you, Ryan. It's a pleasure to be here today with everybody. I'm sorry we're not able to see you in person and share a lunch after this nice presentation, but we are we are doing this as best we can with Zoom, etc. So we will continue on. I'm trying to get to the first slide. So there we go. What I'd like to cover today are talk about some current concerns, not so much research, but some things that you might be wanting to look at your farm and sort of what's happening right now. Then talk a little bit about Slug, some progeny testing, our noble fir seedling survival trial, and then finish up with some leader control and some other topics looking at coneworm and twig weevil. So that's kind of the way we're going to be presenting today. I'm going to be using some materials from Rory McDonald, Thomas Whitney, and Judy's helped me on a lot, Judy Kowalski, on a lot of these trials. So with that, I will go to our first poll and
Great. So I've just launched that poll. Everybody should be able to see it now. And you can go ahead and answer those questions directly on the screen. And again, this is just an opportunity for us to get to know all of you. There we go. We're getting a few responses. They're coming in, starting out slow. So the first question is about how long folks have been growing Christmas trees. The second one is about species that folks are growing. And the third question then is about how many trees folks harvest on average each year. We'll just let that populate for a few more seconds here. All right, not seeing any more answers coming in, so we'll go ahead and close that. And well, we had the technical glitch that I was concerned about, which is that my internet just briefly cut out, but I think I'm back. And we'll try this again. So I'm going to end the polling and share those results out. So the first question was about how long folks have been growing Christmas trees, and got kind of an interesting distribution. So about 35% of folks who responded actually say they aren't growers. They don't currently grow Christmas trees. So some folks who are tuning in here just really out of interest, it sounds like. And then for those who are, about 26% have been growing them for 10 to 20 years. 15% say forever. And another 15% say they just got started. In terms of species, it looks like things are pretty well clustered around noble fir, Douglas fir, grand fir, and Nordman fir. 44% also mentioning that they grow other trees, other species. And finally, the number harvested in an average year. Looks like a lot of smaller growers joining us today with fewer than 2,000. Around 85% of the folks who responded said that. So that lets us know a little bit about who's with us today. And Chal, I'm going to close that down and turn it back to you to get into the presentation.
Thank you, Ryan. It's good to know who we're talking with today. So I'd like to again welcome everybody. And so wanted to talk first about kind of what are some current concerns, and these essentially are the calls that I've been getting most frequently in the office or at home. So this has been a surprising year for calls about eriophyte mites. And eriophyte mites are different than spider mites. They're probably half the size of a spider mite. You'll need a pretty good hand lens to see these little creatures. But they're kind of cigar shaped, a little wider at the back, but can cause a lot of damage. One of the growers that called me last week said he was finding upwards of 100 mites on a needle. And so you almost, when you get to that number, you look at the needle and it's almost like it's moving around with the mites, and you may just think you see something moving up until you get up to about a 20 to 30 power hand lens. So just a warning that they're out there, and this seems to be a pretty bad year for mites. A couple of the growers had mentioned, we talked about what to use to control mites, and they were using a chemical called Akari. There's a long list of possible sprays and chemicals that are useful for controlling eriophyte mites on the Pacific Northwest insect handbook. If you do a search or go to the website that Judy Kowalski and I have put together, you'll find a list of possible control chemicals for mites and other things. Another one that's been popular this year among growers has been, sadly, root weevils. Root weevils, right at this point, you're seeing girdling at the base of newly planted seedlings. And you may start noticing a few seedlings, particularly as it warms up, that are starting to die, turn red. So the target here is looking at trying to spray for the adults. We're seeing both strawberry and juniper root weevils right now. So Brigade has been one of the common insecticides that are used for controlling root weevils. They can kill newly planted seedlings and even occasionally mature trees, but the newly planted seedlings are probably the most tender for root weevils right now. So that's been another common concern in some fields. And again, and the insect handbook has some spray recommendations and some cultural recommendations for control. Another issue that's been going on for a couple of years, it isn't just this year, is we're seeing a lot of noble fir that's dying, and these are large noble firs, usually in production areas for boughs. And what I'm showing here is just a Google aerial photo of, you'll see the red noble fir in a bough production area, and it looks like it's starting near the bottom and working up on the slope. Some of the things that we notice in the field with this is that young trees may not be impacted. We're seeing damage from Salem to Silverton. Some big areas are affected by this condition, with noble fir dying, and it seems to be spreading. What you see up close, and this is an up close version of that same field that I was showing on Google Earth. So we're looking back up the slope now after a snowstorm, and starting to observe patterns and look at what's happening in these fields. So when you start looking around, what we find is that, at least in this field, the younger noble fir nearby was not impacted. The Douglas fir to the north of this field wasn't showing any damage, but we were seeing probably half of the noble fir in this bough stand either dead or dying. So, you start digging around and observing patterns and cutting down trees and removing bark. And this is some of the things that we're seeing. On this particular site, in cutting down some trees, we were seeing patches in the stump that look to be, some sort of root rot, either Phytophthora or Anosis or both. So we're getting patches of cambium layer that was dead. And here I'm just showing with my cursor some of the dead cambium area on this noble fir, and some staining, which would be more indicative of maybe Anosis root rot. When we look more closely at the stems of the trees, you're seeing a lot of these exit holes. And this is the pattern of the fir engraver beetle. So particularly these kind of horizontal gallery chambers right here are indicative of the fir engraver beetle killing the trees in this particular stand. And we found a lot of different beetles in the trees, Buprestid beetles, Pityopterus beetles, and I'm sure some that I don't know what they are. So it appears, in terms of diagnosing this problem, that what we're seeing is the noble fir has been subjected to some pretty dry summers in the last 5 or 6 years. So the trees have been stressed by potentially these dry, hot summers. There's probably some Anosis root rot going on, and those stressed trees then start to attract the beetles, and the beetles are kind of finishing off stressed trees. So sadly, there's not much that you can do. There's not pheromone attractants or disaggregating attractants for these particular beetles. So cutting trees down and getting rid of the population of beetles when the trees are attacked are about the only thing that can be done. If you see holes where there's pitch coming out, that's the tree's response to the beetle burrowing into the tree, and that's a good sign because they're, the trees are healthy enough to have enough pitch to try to get rid of the beetles. If the holes are dry and you're seeing sawdust, that's not a good sign. The trees are weak and are not able to pitch the beetles out. So that seems to be what's going on with some of our bough stands in the valley. Some of the things that you might be looking at or should have been doing maybe last week, and I'm showing this slide just to remind folks that interior needle blight of noble fir can be a major problem if your trees start to develop this pattern of the trees on the left where the older needles are starting to senesce. They'll turn brown and start to fall off or stay on the tree. So there's two kind of conditions. One is normal sloughing off of needles where the needles fall off pretty easily. But if the needles are staying on the tree and dying, the chances are that you could have this interior needle blight problem, which is a combination or caused by 4 or 5 different fungi. So the cure or the preventative measures for this problem is spraying with fungicide, Bravo, Quadris, but both only protect the new growth. So the spray should be going on at about the point where the new growth is coming out at about an inch or up to 2 inches at the broadest. And the sprays prevent the healthy needles from becoming infected. So you'll need probably 2 years before you'll start seeing good results from having healthy foliage from this year's growth outward. So you'll need some time to correct this problem if it's a problem on your fields. Again, spraying before the needles get out very long, longer than 2 inches. And that's probably happening about now or last week, depending on your sites. So when it gets the hot weather that's coming up and predicted this week, probably that's the point of where you're not going to be needing to do any more spraying. So the needles are out farther than needed. So that's kind of a summary of some of the current conditions that I wanted to share with you, and then going into a little bit more of some of the research projects that we've got going on. One is Turkish and Nordman fir progeny testing, and I noticed in the poll that a fair number of people are growing Turkish and Nordman fir. And just to give you an introduction to this trial that's just been planted at 5 different places in the last month. This is a tree. The trees on the left are kind of Scott Godwin at Holiday Tree Farms, showing what some of the sources look like after 1 year of growing. So they were a bit taller than this when we planted them out in the field. And the slide on the right is one of the test sites that was planted about 3 weeks ago. So that's a progeny test that's going to be, we'll be watching it for the next 8 years, or someone will be watching it. And the growers will be taking care of the sites. To give you a sort of a sense of what's being tested in these sites, we have 16 different sources of trees at 5 different locations. There's 25 trees of each source at each site. So it's a mix of provenance testing. So we've got 4 Danish Nordman fir seed stands. So the one of them is Barrett's, Tabugi, Borshomi, and Lundbygard. So these are essentially estates in Denmark where they've been growing Nordman fir for years, and they've set up orchards that seed is collected from and sold. 3 of these have been in production, the Barrett's, Tabugi, and Borshomi for a number of years. Lundbygard is a new source from a orchard that's probably the most recent of all of these. We have a Turkish fir source, Bolu Kukez provenance. We have 2 Ambulori provenances, Nikorts Minda and Talugi. We have a Borshomi provenance that's Tadrisi. We have a Russian provenance that's probably in the coldest of all of the sources that we've been testing, called Obsheronks. It's near Sochi in the mountains of Russia. It is apparently a fairly fast growing source. We'll see how well it performs in our environments. And we have 7 local family selections from Westland Farms that we're including in this trial to compare with these others. So in terms of what's going to be happening for these trials, again, they were just planted. We just finished the last planting a week ago. The next thing we'll be doing with this trial will be looking at bud break. Next year we'll be doing some evaluations of bud break. We'll probably do a midterm evaluation for growth and quality. And then when the trees are getting close to harvest, we'll do an evaluation of how the trees performed for height and grade and color and sort of the standard things that growers or buyers would be looking for when they buy trees. So this is trying to move the needle forward for both Turkish and Nordman fir, as more and more growers are starting to be interested in these new species from Georgia and Turkey. To give you a sense of a little, to put this in perspective of where some of these collections happen, this is a Google Earth view of the Ambulori region of Georgia, the Talugi forest, kind of middle of in the country of Georgia. It's a large forested area. So this is probably the most commonly collected source for European Nordman fir and for sources that you can purchase out in Oregon. So the Talugi forest is a vast area across, it's kind of the north slope of a mountain. And we were visiting there last year in Georgia doing some collection, and I'll show you a little bit about what some of those sources look like, so you have a little more familiarity with this particular source since it's so popular. But this was an area that was subject to a huge forest fire probably 50, 60 years ago. And this forest, the Talugi Nordman fir forest, has come up kind of even aged, and it's very thick. And if this is the forest here on the left. So the phrase that it's hard to see the forest for the trees very much applies to trying to figure out what tree goes with what foliage in this stand of trees. And this is myself and Gary and Rick Bates and our host Kaha looking through this forest a year ago, trying to find trees that had good seed potential or good form potential for collection. Just a close up of some of the foliage. The only way we could get a good handle on some of the trees of this area was to kind of look at it from the meadow, from the hay fields on the north side of this massive burn that happened. So this is just what some of these older trees look like, dense forest. Another area that we've collected, or that has been collected for this particular test that we just finished planting, is this Niekort's Minda area. Again, it's in the Ambalori region again, which are kind of in the northern Caucasus Mountains of Georgia. This is Talugi here, and Niekort's Minda is over here. So that's a site that happens to be interesting in that it has fairly high rainfall area, but very cold. So we're hoping to see what we can see in from collections of this area. So the collection that we just planted, the source that we just planted this last month, is a broad provenance collection from somewhere in this area. We don't quite know where the seed was collected. In a trial that we're working on currently, we'll be selecting individual trees within that forest. So that'll be planted, or we'll be collecting some of the seed next year. Just a sense of what we're looking for in the kinds of trees that if we're doing individual collections. These are some just examples of trees that we identified when we were over there that we want to go back to, hoping that there'll be some seed to collect this next fall. So keep waiting. It's an ongoing project. Wanted to also talk about our noble fir trial and just give you a sense of what goes into a noble fir progeny test, and showing this because we finally evaluated our last plot from this trial last week. So this was a noble fir trial that was planted in 2012, but it starts even that trial, like all of them, started a number of years before the planting. So we had the inkling that this was an area that we wanted to do more testing and collection because of some BLM trees that had proven very prominently in an earlier progeny test. So we wanted to go back to this area, which is above Tillamook, and do some more detailed collections. So Jim Bays and Mark Schmidlin and Jim Heater and myself went back with Rod McNeil and some others to do some collections from individual trees in 2009 and 2010. So this was an area that is called Edwards Butte and Gold Peak. So it's kind of above on the Coast Range. If you get on some of the ridges, you can see blimp hanger in Tillamook on a nice clear day. And it's about, I think, around 2,000 feet in elevation. Just a picture of some of the noble fir that's growing fairly thick up in that area. We did some collections on individual trees and are hoping, of course, that those proved like they'll be important for Christmas tree plantations in the future. So the planting on the left took place in 2012, and this is the same planting kind of mid-rotation, that heritage plantation. So that's what it looked like the day it was planted and a number of years after planting on the right. The last plot was evaluated last week. So again, it's an area around Tillamook that had sources that were loosely called Edwards Butte and Gold Peak. There's also, in this trial, we had 10 untested sources from the Hostetler seed orchard. These were grafted in the early 70s, with Ken Brown and Mike Ramsby working on the seed orchard at Hostetler, but they'd never been tested. They were just beautiful trees in a field that was grafted into the orchard. And so this progeny test it was planted in 2012 allowed us to finally get those trees into a test. We started with 5 test sites. One of them succumbed to Phytophthora ananosus root rot. So these are on different sites. One site was harvested 2 years ago. So we did the evaluation 2 years ago. 2 other sites were evaluated last year. And the last remaining site we just finished again last week. So there's a wide range in when these sites were ready to be harvested and how quickly they grew in different areas. So this is just the average from, just to explain a little bit about how we've done some of the evaluations for determining which are the good trees or which are the ones that aren't so hot. So to give you a sense of, these are just the numbers of the numbers that we named the families off to the left. Height is just simply measuring the trees to the highest point where they were trimmed. Grade is the lower the number, the better the grade. So we gave a premium tree a number 1 tree, we gave a 2 just for evaluation. Color, the higher the number, the darker blue-green the color. Some of CSNN is just abbreviation for summing the damage that we were finding on the trees from current season needle necrosis. So I wanted to give you just a preview of how we do the evaluations for trials like this. So we looked particularly at height and grade. So value of trees is largely a function of height primarily. Secondarily, it's a function of grade. But we're always looking also at the color of the tree and the sum and whether or not the tree has needle necrosis. Jokingly, I've often said that it's hard to test. It's hard to tell people how good trees are when you've got a nice field of good-looking trees. But I could sell genetic improvement maybe easier if we could give each grower a sampling of the worst trees in the trial. So just for grins, let's say we were able to give you all tree number 44. So of all of the trees in this test, it was the shortest. It had the crappiest grade of all the trees. They were mostly coals. It was mostly yellow and had a lot of current season needle necrosis. And so jokingly, if you all had number 44, you'd realize that at least on the dark side, we could produce some very poor looking trees. But on the brighter side, what we're looking for are the best trees, and we look for, you know, trees that have good height, excellent grade, nice color, and very few problems with needle necrosis. So Edwards Butte number 6, which is this number 41, came out to be the highest tree in the test. And this is an average of 75 trees on 3 different sites over a number of years. So Edwards Butte number 6 was the tallest, had a nice, pretty good grade. 3.8 is a good color, and low number for needle necrosis. So if we look just at this column is arranged by first in height, and this column is arranged by first in grade. So B11, which is this tree number 26, was the 3rd place in height, but it was interestingly enough the first for grade. Had a great color, and again fairly low on needle necrosis, although not quite as low as Edwards Butte number 6. So to make a longer story, maybe a little shorter, we identified these 2 sources, Edwards Butte 6 and B11, which comes out of the Hostetler seed orchard, as 2 very promising next generation sources that we wanted to keep in our seed orchards. So the way to capture that gain is to graft these sources into seed orchards. So this is just a shot of this particular oval area right here happens to be a noble fir seed orchard at the North Willamette station. There's other orchards that are going in. This is a noble fir orchard here. This is a Doug fir orchard. This is a Turkish fir orchard, and this is a small Nordman fir holding orchard. Lots of different types of seed orchards that are out there. And this is just one example of an orchard where those 2 sources, Edwards Butte 6 and B11, were grafted out here this last March, and they were also included in some other orchards. So that's the way that we're kind of capturing these good families and trying to get seed produced from them. So just showing some of the grafting, in this case on a probably a Nordman fir here on the left. And this is one of my favorite pictures, March Midland and his grandson out collecting noble fir cones at the Barney Douglas orchard. So we do the grafting, wait a few years, and then collect seed when we get a good seed year. And that's kind of the process of tree improvement in Christmas trees. So changing topics, we're going to be looking at some work that Rory McDonald's been doing on slugs and Christmas trees. And the first question that Rory was asking was, what species are contaminating our trees? So we know that a number of export destinations don't want slugs. And so one in particular has been Hawaii. So if they're finding slugs when the trees reach Hawaii and some other ports of entry, those trees have to go either back to the shipper or go through a process of cleaning the load up, and both can be very, very expensive. But before getting too far ahead, Rory wanted to ask the question of what species of slugs are infesting our trees and where do they come from. So the process that Rory used and what we were involved with there was 10 noble fir plantations throughout Oregon and Washington that were sampled for slug populations and 6 holding yards. So this was, the holding yards were the shipping areas in October, November, December that were sampled. So the plantation sampling was done with these mats here where the slugs congregate beneath the mats, or we had samples of these same mats cut in half or longitudinally, and we attached the mats to the trunk of the tree to see whether or not the slugs were going up into the tree or just on the ground. And then these mats were used on the holding yards on the shipping areas to see whether where the slugs might be getting into the trees. The results over a 2-year period of sampling was that there was, in the plantations, we caught 799 slugs from 5 different species. In the shipping yards, there were 465 slugs, again from 5 species. And the species distributions between the plantations and the yards were a little bit different. The most common slug that we found in both plantations and yards were this Duroceras species right here. It's not one that is restricted in Hawaii or in most of the export areas, but slugs are not easily identified. So these slices of the pie here and here, though, are slugs that are the ones down here, this Arion intermedius and subfusus and etc., that are what's called actionable species. These are ones that if they're found, the load is either recleaned or shipped back. So those are slugs that we don't want in particular, and we'd rather not have any if we can avoid it. So Rory and all of us were asking the question about, were slugs crawling up into the trees, or were they getting into the trees just because the trees were sitting on the ground? And the answer was yes, they were crawling up in the trees. There were fewer species that we found, but 25 slugs at 5 different plantations for some reason decided to crawl up the trees, and this was the distribution of the slug species that we were finding crawling up into the trees. So not as many, but we're still finding slugs making their way into the trees. To give you just a brief introduction to how to identify these guys. This is the most common slug that we have in Christmas trees, the gray field slug. Again, it's not one that will cause rejections as long as they can identify this slug from the other ones, but fairly common and but not, it's pretty ubiquitous, found in a lot of places around the country, and I think it was introduced into Oregon, if I remember right. This one is an actionable species, again, the hedgehog sludge, and it's near the back end. It's got some very sharp edges to it on the back. The dusty slug has this kind of broad pad on its backside. It is one that causes rejection of the load if it's found. The tail dropper slug is another one. They all look a little different from each other, but again, the most common is that Duroceras species. Control options, there are molluscicides that you can put out particularly in the shipping yard. There's less. Not all of these are available to be put out in the fields. Some of the ways that slugs can be controlled tillage, hand picking, traps, barriers, shaking at the end are all possibilities. Probably the thing that has been the most useful in terms of keeping the slugs off the trees is to keep the trees off the ground as best you can. So when they're harvested, try to get them back to the harvest yard as quickly as possible. Use pallets to put the trees on when they're stored. Those are some of the things that help with reducing the population of slugs in trees. Just some more additional updates. Some new labels that just came on in 2020 after some little bit of research trials. One is an insecticide, Transform. It's a Bayer product. It's one that we were doing some helicopter trials on some fields of Mackenzie noble fir in the Silverton Hills area. Tyler and Ben Stone were very helpful in helping us on this trial. So this last year, we were successful in getting Christmas trees added to the Transform insecticide label. It's probably one of those that might be looked at as a substitute for Lorsban. So effective on aphids, mostly effective on sucking insects like aphids that attach themselves to the needle and try to suck the juices out of the tree. So Transform is a new label this year. Something that you might want to consider if you have aphid problems. Another herbicide that is new. It's not a new herbicide, but Christmas trees were newly added to the label. It's probably too late to do any work with this herbicide this year, but it's something that you might consider for next year's kind of residual or pre-emergent weed control for grass and broadleaf. So keep looking at some of these new labels for both insecticide and herbicide control. So with that, I'm going to kind of turn it back to Ryan to have our midterm poll. So Ryan, the screen is yours.
All right, and I've called in on the phone in case my video drops out again. At least you'll all still be able to hear me. So yeah, I had no idea, Chal, that slugs were such a major pest in Christmas tree production. That was really interesting to me. So we do have a mid-presentation poll that I'm going to put up here. I'm going to go ahead and launch that right now for everyone to answer. You should see it on your screen. Looks like some questions, Chal, that you're asking to try to inform some of the work that you're doing. And while that's up, we do have a couple of questions that have come in, and maybe we'll just take those while folks are hopefully able to answer the poll. I don't see any answers coming in yet, but please try to get there if you can. So, Chal, first question is, for a given species, for example, Douglas fir, and a given seed zone, is Christmas tree seed stock any different than other tree seed stock?
Yeah, great question. Yes, it's different than let's say Douglas fir. So what a timberland owner is primarily interested in is our trees that grow fast and don't have a lot of knots, for example, and which means branches. So the fast growth we can deal with, but we'd like to have more branches. So the things that we're looking for, particularly in Douglas fir Christmas trees, are rapid growth is great, but not too fast. But we're also looking for lots of branches with upright growth, good form, and disease and color are fairly heritable traits for Christmas tree growers. So it's not like we would be excluding Christmas tree productions and for Christmas tree growers, but we look for a little bit different traits in trees than timber producers. So a lot of timber production now is from seed orchards that are designed for timber production, and we've got seed orchards that are designed for Christmas tree production. So a wild selection may not make a whole lot of difference, but if you're looking at seed orchards or trying to get the best for individual purposes, you'd like to get a Douglas fir from Christmas tree seed orchard or Christmas tree traits. So hope that wasn't too muddled an answer. So other questions?
Oh, that was great. Yeah, second question that's up goes back to the trial that you were talking about earlier. And the question is there a key available to show the other noble fir clones that were tested in that trial?
Yeah, I could send, if you want to send me your email address, I can certainly send you the sources that were included in that trial. And that's just one of many. We've had, I think since 1996, we've had 7 different trials. And we'll be summarizing the different sources that have been tested on our website as well. So that'll include some of the other trials.
Is that something, Chal, maybe that you could upload to the resources for this presentation, or is it more of is the email directly a better way to go?
Happy to do both. If I've got the list of what sources were in the 2012 trial handy, and I can send that to you, Ryan. The summary of all the trials, all the trees in the trial since 1996 and before will probably be best handled on my Christmas tree website.
Okay. Well, we'll get the information out there.
Great.
I'm going to go ahead and it looks like about a little over half of the folks have participated in the poll. I'm going to go ahead and end that and share those results out here. So the first question was about the largest impediment in getting trees to market size. And it looks like disease and insect damage is really topping the list, followed by seedling mortality, and then to a lesser extent, labor shortages and shortage of seedlings to plant. And the second question was, if you were funding research on Christmas trees, what topics would you fund? And this one is split a little bit, but the top choice, again, relating back to the insect and disease issue that was sort of highlighted in the answer to the first one, and then kind of a split between tree improvements and research into long-term site productivity. And then it looks like consumer or artificial tree issues. That's an interesting one. That one came in at 11%, and needle loss came in at 21%, the response there. And then the third question just related to COVID-19 and what impact that has or might have on operations. Fewer people answered this question, but of those who answered, it looks like most weren't sure, followed by folks who seemed to feel that it wasn't really going to be a big issue for them. And then kind of down towards the bottom, labor supply restrictions on U-cut customers and fewer customers going to retail lots. So some interesting responses there, a little bit all over the map on that third one. So I'm going to go ahead and turn that off. Close it up, and let's see here. Got a couple more questions came in. Maybe we'll try to fit them in real quick. One is, how does trimming influence quality of Christmas trees or Christmas tree quality?
Yeah, good question. It's a must in Christmas trees. I always get a kick out of our own farm that people will come out to our farm for a noble fir or a Nordman fir, and they say they want a tree that hasn't been trimmed. And I'll show them a tree that hasn't been trimmed, and I'll show them one that has been trimmed lightly or heavily, and they say, "Oh, I want that one that has been trimmed." So, so trimming is necessary because the trees start to grow just too fast as they age. So, but you can do it in ways to make them look more natural. You can make them look denser and thinner and tighter. So, and we've got some videos on the website about how to do trimming and different strategies on trimming trees. And if we get to it, we'll talk a little bit about some of our leader control trials that have been going on. So trimming is a must.
And I noticed that Mike did post a link to your website in the chat box. So folks who are interested in seeing some of those videos or accessing the other information, that link is available there. Two more questions, and then we should get back to the presentation. Referring back again to the noble fir trial, I think the question is whether those trees are being sheared.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, these trees, the trees on our genetic trials are all kind of part of the production of wherever the grower, for the grower's site. So the five growers that we included in this trial, they are simply pruning and shaping those trees just like they would their own plantation. So yes, they've all been sheared, but they've been sheared in whatever manner the different growers use for their markets. We've had some trials where we didn't shear trees, and I don't think we learned a whole lot more from having them unsheared than we did from the trees that were sheared. So yeah, they were all sheared.
And then the last one here, I think this is a response to your question in the poll, someone asking back if COVID-19 has impacted your work and your research.
It certainly impacted my work. I mean, I've been here at home for what, 2 months now. And so to go out to our field sites, I need a fair amount of permission from my various bosses. So, and to work at the station at North Willamette, I need to get approval. And those, isn't easy to get. So we're looking forward to the end of being able, hopefully getting out and doing more of this. So it's impacted certainly my ability to get out and do things, and would have much rather done this with having a lunch at tree school. So anyway, thanks for asking.
Yeah, I think we're all in that same place for sure. So that's all the questions we had up. We've got about 22 more minutes left for presentation. So let's get back to that.
Thank you. So we will start on talking about, we're going to talk about seedling survival. I know that was an issue that came up in the poll, and any of you that are growing noble fir in the last 4 or 5 years on unirrigated fields, which is 99% of Christmas tree fields, have, I'm sure, experienced mortality everywhere from entire plantations of noble fir failing to, better survival than the normal mortality. So in looking at our test plots over the last 20 years or 30 years, normal mortality for noble fir is somewhere around 10 to 12%. But in 2015, 17, and 18, with these dry, hot summers that we've been experiencing, mortality could range from entire failures to anywhere, in between. On our farm, we were probably losing about 50% of what we planted in those years. So with that in mind, Kirk Company approached us and said, let's do some work on trying to see if we can do any kind of treatment short of watering that would improve survival. So in 2018, we put in a trial on some 2.0 bare root machine planted sites that were planted in May 4th of 2018. The treatments that we looked at for this trial was we included a root dip, a commercially available conifer root dip called Roottex, kind of a humic acid high in phosphorus. We dipped the seedlings before they were planted on May 4th and then planted them. We also had some post-treatment applications of a treatment called Moisture Lock, and it's an anti-transpirant sprays that we had. Some of the trees we sprayed just once on June 6th, and some of the trees we sprayed twice on June 6th and July 11th. We also had tree shades, and that's what the tree shades look like. They're essentially shade cloth with a wire frame around them. And we monitored the trees with temperature monitors and evaluated mortality on August 16th and August 10th. And we had very sophisticated mortality evaluations, healthy, sick looking, and dead. So those were the three categories that we used to evaluate the planted seedlings in 2018. So the test layout, this is what the test looked like. There are row treatments for Roottex and Moisture Lock that included about 1,200 trees. The shade tents were overlaid across the treatments in different rows. I talked about how the evaluation was made, and then we did temperature monitoring, some with shade, some without shade, and we had hourly temperatures for 6 months. So that's what the plantation looked like once we got it established, and that was fairly soon after the trees were planted and before a lot of the weeds had grown up. So, but there was also weed control from the grower. So summary, in mid-August, we had about 27% mortality across all treatments. By mid-October, we had 31% of the trees that were planted were dead. If we looked at the October results by treatment, on the shade, the trees that had shade only had a 13% mortality. So Roottex and Moisture Lock, they didn't seem to help. So the mortality on those treatments was pretty much the same as what it was across the whole field. So 31% mortality or thereabouts for non-shade. Trees with shade, we had a lot better survival. And these were not watered. We just let nature take its course and got what we got at the end of the summer. This is just looking at our temperature monitoring, and this is just looking at the maximum temperatures that occurred in the month, and the no shade is the green bars, which are a little higher than the brownish temperatures that have the shade. So the shade helped in reducing the temperatures across this field, and we were getting, some of the fields, we were getting July temperatures upwards of 117 degrees. So we got some relief with the shade on the trees, and there's nothing specific about, these shade cloths. Anything that can provide some dead shade would be we've used milk cartons, cardboard boxes, anything, old shingles, anything that you can provide shade would be helpful in terms of keeping that temperature down. So we were encouraged by that trial in 2018, and in 2019 we did another trial with Kirk companies and CBM, looking at some other treatments that were promising. So this year we had a little bit early planting. April 25th is when the 2-year-old bare root planting and some Slug 1 nobles were put in on a Kirk company site, all machine planted. The treatments at Kirk company were a number of root dips and foliar sprays. We used a root dip called Stroma Boost, which is a 17-4 fertilizer with, again, I think with some humic acid. We did that as a root dip. We did some root dipping in a product called Dynaum, which is a high phosphorus product that was applied in 8 ounces in 3 gallons. And we also used it as a spray on the top in the middle of June. The Stoma Boost was just used as a root dip. We also had a product called Green Masui, or however that's pronounced. Again, sort of a high phosphorus spray over the top. We used shade, and we added a treatment of mulch, just basically wood chips around the base of the trees. So it had a lot more root dips and sprays and some other treatments with the mulch and shade. So we had another site looking at some of the similar treatments with CBM up in Molal, a little higher elevation site planted on May 1st. And that was a second trial. We included some treatments up at that site, included B1 transplant. It's kind of a root starter, root dip. And we also included a product that they were using called Solid Rain, a polymer crystal that was injected at the tree root area on a device that was on the back of their planting machine. So we had both B1, Solid Rain, shades, and mulch, and an untreated check at the CBM site. Solid Rain, this is what it looks like after it swells up and forms a gel after a rain or when it absorbs water. The hope is that it will release the water to the tree roots as the tree needs the water. We use the shade again, and we just use wood chips on both the CBM site and at the Kirk company site in Molala. So that's what the Kirk company site looked like on May 6th. And that's what the CBM site looked like on May 7th. We also had the site set up that if we were going to add a treatment where we irrigated the trees or had water applied to the site if we needed it. We did moisture monitoring in the soil that was recording moisture levels on the soil every 2 weeks. We monitored temperatures, and we did 3 mortality evaluations. Long story short, these are the results. Luckily for the growers, I mean, last year was a nice year for seedling survival at the Kirk site 1. The untreated check, we had about 20% mortality. The root dips that we had at that site didn't help at all. The mortality with the root dips was just about the same as the untreated check. The shade provided a little bit of relief. We had the mortality with the shade was about 12%. The mulch, for some reason, was the very best. It was even better than the mulch and the shade, although there's maybe not a statistical difference there. Mulch was quite promising. So mulch might be something to consider for seedling survival, short of watering. The results at the CBM site were even better. They had only 5% mortality. The B1, the shade, all the other treatments didn't make a whole lot of difference, but it was interesting to see that the solid rain in this case had a little lower mortality, but mortality was very low overall at this site. So it was a great year for noble fir seedling survival. Not a great year for our test, but good year for the survival of noble fir. The weed control at each site was a little bit different, and so some of the mortality at the Kirk site may have been from a little more weed competition than at the CBM site, but that is still a bit of an open question. So to summarize, the 2019 was a great year for noble fir seedling survival. In years that, if we have more years like 2018, 15, and 17, growers may want to consider supplemental watering. I know that's a pain to do. It's very difficult to haul water out to these plantations where it's, unless you've got water close by. From talking just anecdotally to growers that have done watering, there's various techniques that some have used to bring water to the trees, everywhere from having 3 or 4 people on the back of a nurse tank, walking slowly and watering the trees. What some of the suggestions have been for those that have been doing watering, and we've done it at our farm, is to make sure that you're not just wetting the surface of the soil and having the water run off. So, anything you can do to make kind of a moat around the seedlings to contain the water, inject the water into the soil, water slowly with some sort of emitters that don't just cover the top of the soil surface and wash away. Also, try to get the water on before the trees start to look peaked. So, if the trees are starting to run out of water first part of June, or July, more likely, start it as soon as you can. Try to get about about a quart per tree if you can, and try to get it down into the root zone. You might want to dig a couple of holes to just see how far down the water is going. We didn't have enough information on how the solid rain might work in a drought year, but that's still sort of an open question. Weed pressure and cover crops, that's, it's a bit of an open question to see how much water or the cover crop may be using or providing. So, but a lot of weed pressure can be damaging if they're sucking water out of the soil as well. So, just want to, that's a summary of our seedling trial. Just real briefly, in the time that's remaining, we're continuing work with this leader control. And we talked about culture work with Christmas trees. This is a product that we've been testing, abscistic acid, to limit the growth of the leader. And the idea here is that you can apply this material, and it's applied with a device called an easy roller, rolled on the leaders, and you can use this material to control the length that your leader grows. So, for example, if you've got a leader that's typically going to grow, let's say 20 inches, if you apply this product at the right rate and the right time, you can keep the growth within 1 to 2 inches of expansion. So a 20-inch leader can now, you could potentially have it only 12 inches long with the same number of buds that you would have at 20 inches. So you could increase the density of the tree and not have to cut the tops. So, and that's problematic, particularly on Nordman and Turkish fir, because once you start cutting the tops, it's not a guarantee that you're going to get straight tops the next season. So that's one of the main fits for particularly Nordman and Turkish, but also for Noble, because tying up tops, can be one of the more expensive and time-consuming parts of growing trees. So I'm going to skip through a lot of these slides fairly quickly. So we've started with some trials, and certainly you can put on too much material. So we're pulling the tops, which is not a good thing to do. But if you use the right rate at the right time, you can get fairly good control on Turkish and Nordman fir and Nobles. We'll be starting some trials later this week. These are some of the damage levels that we've been seeing depending on rates. And we're dialing in the rates so we can get, we're hoping to get down into the 0 to 1 level of damage. This is what success looks like. You've got what would have been naturally probably a 20-inch leader is now about 12 inches long, and all the buds that would have been extended along that 20-inch leader are now within a foot or so. And so those are some of the issues that we're working with. We've been experimenting with different rates of surfactant. And this is just some trials looking at different rates of leader extensions. So just to summarize this trial on Turkish fir, the untreated check, and these were trees that grew beyond our 10-inch target. So these trees leaders were on average 22 inches long if we didn't do anything, but we could get them down to within 12 inches fairly consistently, but we could also cause a lot of damage if we use too much surfactant. And that's kind of what the rest of these slides show as just our tests with different rates and different sites that have a different kind of inherent growth potential for Nobles and Turkish fir. Just to summarize that trial, you only want to roll them once. If you roll them twice, you're going to get a lot of damage. If you roll the trees, apply the chemical after 20 days with the same tree, there's not a particular problem. The rates are going to be somewhere around 200 to 400 mils. This doesn't have a label yet. We're going to get one hopefully this next year. 1 liter of mix will treat around 1,400 trees, and it takes about, you can do 6 trees in a minute. So that's kind of how quickly this can go on. I'm going to stop there and move on to, we're going to talk about twig weevil and megastismus issues. Till next time, I want to thank some folks and give you a brief intro to what's coming on this afternoon. So Ryan, I'll turn it back to you, and we can take some questions or talk about what's coming up this afternoon with Dan Stark.
Great, yeah, thank you. Since the slide's up there, yeah, for folks on the line here, just a reminder that we have another webinar this afternoon at 3 o'clock with Dan Stark, and he's going to be talking about everything you need to know if you want to plant some trees. A simple topic, kind of like today's topic, I think pretty broad. So we do have about 10 minutes remaining, and if it takes longer, we can go into some overtime as well. I'm going to also be posting a wrap-up poll here as well, just to collect some feedback from all of you about this webinar. So I'll put that up here in a minute or two. But in the last 10 minutes or so, Chal, got a few questions that have come in for you. Folks were pretty interested in the slides you shared on your tree establishment studies. I think probably indicative of the pretty dry spring, summer seasons we've had over the last decade or so. And so there were a few different questions about the shade. And you talked about that a little bit, but wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about the types of structures that you might use to create the shade. And then one question too is kind of how much shade is necessary?
Yeah, the commercial structures that we used on this trial, those were, I think TerraTech is a company in Eugene that sells these shade cloth devices. And at least when we bought them 3 or 4 years ago, they were running about, with the shade and the frame, they were, I think, 39 cents, probably more now. I've been using the same shade cloths for 3 years, so they last at least that long, and they probably will last a lot longer. I mean, they look like they're in pretty good shape. We've used misprinted milk cartons with we have some curlicue stakes that we put those in to hold the milk cartons up. This was a brainchild of Kirk Stroda down south that was using the milk cartons to put around the tree to stop some rodent damage. We just use them as shade on the southwest side of the trees, held in place by these curlicue wire stakes. I've seen people use shakes and shingles, the old shakes and shingles. So anything that you can do to provide the shade. We've taken all the shade cloth up in October so that the trees aren't shaded through the winter. But you want something that's probably at least, I want to say 6 to 8 inches in width and a foot or so tall on the southwest side of the tree. That's about the size and usefulness of, and it can be full shade or these kind of shade cloth materials. That's probably, I don't know, 60% shade.
And could you mention one more time just the name of the company that made the little shade devices that you referred to in your study?
It's a company called TerraTech in Eugene, and they sell forestry supply equipment. And there may be other companies that make them as well, but that's the company that we use.
Great. Somebody mentioned on the Q&A here that there's probably enough campaign signs floating around this time of the year to use as shade structures as well.
Good idea. Put them to good use.
A couple other questions on here about mulch. Once this question was posted, you kind of went on to talk a little bit about the benefits that your study did show some benefits of mulch, but maybe you could talk about that just a little bit more. And then another person was wondering if it matters what the source tree is for the chips, for the mulch.
Yeah, all good questions. What we used were just Douglas fir and wood chips. They were just, commercial wood chips that we got from, landscapers. But I've also used, there was a tree trimming company called Asplin that was out by our farm trimming power poles, and they had mulch available from a mix of alder and maple and Doug fir and probably some cedar that they were just chipping in their wood chipper. So we were asked them if they wanted a place to dump their wood chips, and they said they'd be very pleased to dump it on our farm. So I've been using that at our own farm, and it was free. The people have asked about using sawdust and different species. there's been some concerns about using fresh cedar sawdust that might be, somewhat, there may be some chemicals that retard root growth. I'm not sure that that's true, but I've been avoiding some of the sawdust products just because they may tie up nitrogen. So I haven't been trying sawdust. I've been trying fairly coarse chips.
I think a related question then is about the watering that you referred to. Is that something that's done for the first year, or how long would you anticipate needing to water to get the trees established?
It's pretty much just the first year, and it's often may just be nobles, or nobles are going to be the most sensitive. Douglas firs seem to have much better survival. Nordman and Turkish, they have this incredibly deep taproot. So it's principally just that first year, and if you can get them through that and into the second year, unless it's just a horribly dry, hot year that hopefully we won't experience, that first year is the most critical, and the most critical species is noble.
I think, probably very much related to that, some questions about planting trees. The first is, when is the best time to plant Christmas trees?
A lot of, I'd say as early as you can get the seedlings, and you're not mudding the trees in. A lot of growers used to be planting in May and June, and they're moving that planting period back farther and farther. So saw a lot of planting happening this year from February, beginning in February. So I think planting in February, as long as it's just not a muddy mess, is good. A lot of the people that are needing to wait for machine planting, you've got to wait till the ground is ready for the planting machine, but trying to move that planting period up, because you want to get those roots growing before the shoots start emerging. So we didn't finish planting our last progeny test site till 2 weeks ago. So we're going to be kind of monitoring how that site does with nobles, with Nordman and Turkish, whereas we had some of our other test plots we had planted in February. So it'll be interesting to watch that.
And let's see, another question popped in here, but another related question is just about the potential for using larger container stock. Would that be helpful in terms of getting trees established? And is that something that you might see as a trend?
Probably not. I think some of those big, 20, 30 cubic inch container cells I haven't seen any better survival with those than, with using some of our standard styro 12s, 10s and 12s. So, and it's partially a question of balance, because you get this great big tree with, even though you've got a lot of root mass, the balance may be in favor of the top rather than the roots. So I don't think a bigger tree is going to be, helpful in terms of the survival in a dry year. I think you want to look more at the kind of the relative ratio of shoots to roots, and it seems like the 10s and 12s are fine. I've seen pretty high mortality on some of the bigger 20 cubic, those 20 cubic inch cells.
Great. Well, that exhausts the questions related to your shade study and tree establishment. And we are kind of coming up here towards 11:30. I know you had a few slides that you didn't get to, and we can do a little overtime. There is a question about the twig weevil problem and, kind of what the current status is. I don't know, for the folks remaining on the line, if you want to take a few minutes to go back to those slides and talk about some of those issues, we could certainly do it.
Sure, I'd be happy to run through. I don't know how long you want to go back to those, but maybe what I can do is just summarize what we're seeing with the twig weevil.
That'd be great.
What we're seeing right now is that we were out looking for twig weevil last week, and we banged on about, and I wasn't there, but Judy Kowalski and Thomas Whitney took some Nordman fir where we're having some problems, and they bashed probably 15 trees and found I think 10 adult weevils. So the weevils are starting to come out. So the holes that you see on the branches are the exit holes of the weevil, not the entrance holes. The entrance holes are very, very small. So the weevil has been causing problems on Douglas fir, noble fir, and Nordman fir in Turkish. So all the species, we're looking, or Thomas is creating a degree day model and monitoring populations. So we'll hopefully that after this year have a better handle on when to do the spraying. And it's been, some of the pyrethroid sprays have probably been the most effective on controlling the adults. But the twig weevils become a major problem, even though the literature says it's just a problem on Douglas fir in very, very big, very dry years. We're seeing problems on multiple species that have been lasting for the last 3 years. So there have been some very, very dry periods in that. So twig weevils becoming a problem, and it's been the biggest issue in exporting trees into Mexico. So it's one that will hopefully have some more information after this year, but Thomas has been doing a great job on kind of figuring out the biology of this thing and maybe looking into things like how far they may fly and how what to look for to plan your spraying and some degree day models.
Well, I think that exhausts the questions that we've got in the Q&A. I'm not seeing any new ones pop in there. So again, Chal, I really want to thank you for your time today, and I want to thank everybody for joining us this morning. And again, just a reminder that we'll be back again this afternoon at 3 o'clock, and I hope you all can join us then. So,
thank you.
Thank you, and have a good day. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.